Hello, everyone. Today we gather on Good Friday at the foot of the cross. And as we begin, let us pray the prayer in a time of pandemic. God of life, this Holy Week we stand under the shadow of the cross of COVID-19. Each day the number of those infected rise and the death toll climbs. It is a time of fear and confusion as we cry out to you in our distress. As your heart breaks at the suffering of your people, you bend your ear and hear our prayer. As we walk this holy way, help us to empty ourselves and to make a space for your Paschal mystery. Open our eyes to see you, our ears to hear your voice. You do not abandon us, but send your Son Jesus to walk this road with us. With our fragile faith, you give us the courage to always remember how you accompany us along the way, to remind us we're not alone, but stand together under the weight of the cross. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Today we read from a section of the Passion of John's Gospel. I just want to read the few verses that detail Jesus' death. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Seeing his mother there with the disciple whom he loved, Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, there is your son." In turn, he said to this disciple, "There is your mother." From that hour onward, the disciple took her into his care. After that, Jesus, realizing that everything was now finished, to bring the scripture to fulfillment, he said, "I am thirsty." There was a jar there full of common wine. They stuck a sponge soaked in this wine on some hyssop and raised it to his lips. When Jesus took the wine, he said, "Now it is finished." Then he bowed his head and delivered over his spirit. We never forget the last words a loved one speaks to us when he or she dies. My mom will always remember my brother's last words to her. "Goodbye, Mom." She was leaving for the parish where she served as secretary. She did not realize that Ed's goodbye meant it is finished, that his many years he struggled with paranoid schizophrenia were over, and that his mental illness was terminal. A couple hours later, he was dead from suicide. This year, Good Friday, April 10th, would have been my brother Ed's 71st birthday. He was 38 when he died on June 8th, 1987. I had my sister Mary's last words to me. They were text, saved on my phone. But when I got a new phone, I somehow deleted them. I was living in California when Mary, my younger sister, died. And it seemed when I was in the Midwest, those few months before she got sick, we were both too busy to connect. One of her last texts to me said something like, "Hey Joe, sorry I'll miss you again. Hopefully our paths will cross before Thanksgiving. Love you, Mare." And then she wrote a P.S. Mary, like me, was a big fan of the St. Louis Cardinals. And so they were having a lousy summer. So her last words to me were something like, "Cards stink." I may have cleaned that up a little. I did text her on her birthday, and she sent a brief thanks. We're having a great time. She and her fiancé Tom were on vacation. And then the last one was 2 weeks before she was taken to the hospital. I had texted her about something, and she texted back, "Hope all is well with you." Those were Mary's last words to me. Everything was not well with Mary, because by the time I got to the hospital, she was in a coma. Her words about our paths crossing before Thanksgiving came true. I stood by her cross in the ICU and prayed with her and her fiancé and her son, my sister and my mom and family. But Mary was not able to speak. And on Thanksgiving weekend in 2010, she died. She was 47. The last words Jesus speaks from the cross, the famous 7 last words that has become, like the Stations of the Cross, a popular Catholic devotion, capture the life of Jesus. And we have 3 of them in John's account of the Passion. His last words are, "It is finished." But before he speaks those 3 little words to punctuate his life on earth, the words he speaks are both moving and mundane. He movingly says to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he says to his best friend and beloved disciple, "Behold your mother." A son on his death cross, taking care of his mother, asking his best friend to make sure that she would be okay. It's a powerful expression of Jesus' desire to make sure those he loved are taken care of after he dies. But he also says something rather mundane. "I'm thirsty. I thirst." It's something each of us say many times a day. "I'm thirsty." It can refer to a simple request to quench our thirst, but here it evokes a deeper meaning. Our souls thirsting for God when our lives are suffering a drought, dry as a bone, yearning for some refreshing, life-giving stream of mercy and compassion. When I hear those words, "I thirst," I think of Father Rich Kaliga, one of our priests who died during Holy Week in 1995. I saw him in the hospital a few days before his death. His lips were chapped and his mouth parched. He motioned with his eyes to the pitcher on the table by his bed. There was a glass there with a straw, and I moved the straw to his lips, and ever so slightly he drew a sip of water. I thirst. It wasn't water, but a vinegar-soaked sponge the soldiers shoved into Jesus' burning lips. But then he says his last words, "It is finished." Jesus has accomplished what he came to do, to spark a new movement that would change the world, but even more, to show the world how to live, how to love, how to forgive. My friends, Good Friday places us at the cross, at the foot of the crosses and losses of our lives. On Good Friday, we gather around the common ground of our suffering and sorrow, not only our personal and communal losses, but we seek to stand in solidarity with all who suffer today, especially those who have died from COVID-19, those who are struggling for every breath to live, to stay alive, families and friends who are grieving the loss of loved ones claimed by this coronavirus, and all those who will die today. Today, the day Christ died, is the day for each of us to bring to the cross our lives, our love and our loss, our dreams and disappointments, our pain, our promise, our strength and our weakness, our anguish and our grief. On a normal Good Friday, we would venerate the cross in church or in our worship space. It's really one of the most powerful and prayerful and poignant rituals that we have as a people of faith. I really believe that we are at our best as a church on Holy Thursday when we wash feet, and on Good Friday when we celebrate the adoration of the cross. Many of us kiss the cross, and this intimate gesture speaks of our desire to unite our sufferings with the sufferings of Christ, our pain with the pain of Christ. And though we're sheltering in place and practicing social distance this year during this time of pandemic, take down the cross from the wall, hold it in your hands, and whether you kiss the cross or just hold it, do it with intention, as a sacred gesture of solidarity with particular people and prayers, names and events in your mind and in your heart. Another possibility for reverencing the cross today is one that I've used often on retreats. It came to mind several years ago when visiting one of our priests who had been diagnosed with cancer. He told me the doctors were optimistic that they would be able to operate and remove the cancer. And then he did this. He knocked on wood. It was a gesture we use often when we're hoping against hope or when we're hoping for the best. We knock on wood. Today is a good day to knock on the wood of the cross. His gesture sent me to search for the origin of that phrase, and I found a variety of explanations. Evidently, it is such a common phrase in so many cultures that giving credit where credit is due for originating the idea of knocking on wood is difficult. For example, many years before Christ, some cultures believed that the spirits resided in trees, so the spirits would protect their home and family and villages. So the people would knock on the tree, on the trunk of the tree, to wake the spirits when there was a threat about them from an enemy. Knocking on wood was an attempt to wake the spirits to a person's or a tribe's need for protection. It was a way to engage the spirit in a time of crisis. Christians, of course, believe the phrase knock on wood refers to the cross. The phrase connects with the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. One writer suggests that in some traditions, Jesus was crucified on the wood from the tree of paradise, and that is the wood, the tree of the cross, that has been venerated over the centuries. Some people think that when we knock on wood, we're being superstitious, but it's not a silly superstition. It's a sacred gesture. It reminds us that we belong to each other, that we belong to Christ. In the School of Hard Knocks, this is what we do. We knock on the door of the church and say, I want to belong to this community. We knock on the wood of the cross and we say, I believe in the power of Jesus' death and resurrection to save me. The cross is the door to the very heart of God. And we bring to the door of the cross today the names of those who have died, whose last words linger in our minds because they're forever etched on our hearts. We bring to the cross whatever loneliness we feel from this self-isolation that we've experienced the last few weeks because of the coronavirus. We bring whatever brokenness we have, whatever doubt, whatever fears. We bring to the cross the names today of the sick, the lonely, the dying. Bring the poor, the imprisoned, the invisible ones that we pass each day without acknowledging their presence. Because here at the foot of the cross, the blood of Christ seeks to draw all peoples near to the very heart of God. Bring here to the cross those whose dreams have died, those whose relationships have grown cold, those people we find difficult to love. Take your time today. Lay your burdens down and your blessings too at the foot of the cross. You're not alone. For this day we stand by the cross of Jesus with his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and with Mary Magdalene. We stand with the brave women who followed Jesus and did not count the cost. We stand with mothers and fathers who've lost children. I read somewhere, the death of a child is every parent's worst fear, and even our language makes it difficult to talk about. We can speak of widows and orphans, but we have no word for people who've lost a child, for parents who've lost a child. Whatever that word might be, my mom has suffered the loss of 2 children, so I guess the word would be plural. We stand at the cross today with the disciple whom Jesus loved. We stand with all the lonely, the forsaken, the forgotten. We stand with those who are longing for relationship, those longing for community, those longing for a cure, longing for compassion. We stand with those who are in harm's way, with those who are terminally ill, with those who are terrified. We stand at the cross today with all the millions who are out of work because of this pandemic, with those who stand in line at the unemployment office or the food pantry. We stand here with our children, the students and the school children, unable to see their classmates and friends because of the social distancing, especially those who are looking forward to going to their first prom or their graduation ceremony. We stand here with those who are abused, which makes this time of self-isolation even more dangerous. and we stand with those who are depressed and desperate. This is the day Christ died, when we believe that when Jesus stretched out his arms on the cross and uttered those famous last words, "It is finished," he drew everyone near to his heart, to the broken heart of God. And when we place our pain and our suffering at the cross, we place it in something larger than ourselves, because when God's heart breaks, our pain finds a home. Here, standing at the cross, we bring our lives, and we know deep inside that we're not alone. So I invite you to take some time today and read the Passion of Jesus from John's Gospel. The Gospel of John traces how the life of Jesus ultimately led to his crucifixion, and it's a proclamation of truth. Here we see Jesus' integrity. In the interrogation by Pilate, Jesus states emphatically, unambiguously, his purpose in life. "For this I was born, for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth," he says. Pilate says, "What is truth?" We've been trying to answer that question ever since, but the truth was standing and staring Pilate right in the face. And for boldly living his truth, Jesus is condemned and crucified. The first reading on this Good Friday is from the prophet Isaiah, the fourth song of the suffering servant. It foreshadows the experience of Jesus on the cross. The prophet sings of the servant who grew up like a sapling, like a shoot from the parched earth, and how this servant was spurned and avoided by people, a man of suffering, accustomed to infirmity. But it was our infirmities that he bore, our sufferings that he endured. The prophet confirms for us that Jesus was pierced for our offenses, crushed for our sins. Upon him the chastisement is the chastisement that makes us whole. By his stripes we are healed. The letter to the Hebrews echoes our belief in a God who did not hold the world at arm's length, but rather chose to save the world by entering fully into our condition, into the human condition. In the days when Christ was in the flesh, the book of Hebrews says, he offered prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears so to the one who was able to save him from death. Because Jesus was born into this world, he knows what we suffer. He can sympathize with our weakness. Because of this empathy and compassion, the letter to the Hebrews says we can confidently approach the throne of grace to receive mercy and to find grace for timely help. I recall someone once saying that integrity can only come out of disintegration, that integration can only come after we've been disintegrated, that when a dream disintegrates, or a relationship ruptures, or death takes someone we love, we're left to sift through the ruins, the memories, the stories that remind us why this dream, this relationship, this person was so important to us in the first place. We learn the truth of our lives by what we're willing to suffer and maybe even die for the sake of our truth. Good Friday is a good day to remember those dreams that have died, those relationships that have faltered, those people who have died, and to place them here at the foot of the cross. Because today, the face of God takes on a human face. It's a face of anguish and suffering and sorrow. Today, God stands with us in the wreckage and the ruins of our lives. You know, our ancestors believed that Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden on a Friday, which is why Jesus was crucified on a Friday. But why do we call it Good Friday? Because today is all about grace. We see the fullness of grace reflected and revealed in a human being loving other human beings so much that he's willing to die so that others might live. This is not just a spur-of-the-moment act of bravery, but God looking at all the other options and saying, there's no other way to save the world. Brute strength won't convince the world where only the strong survive. Power won't influence people where the quest for power is all-consuming. Money isn't the answer, since money can't buy time or love. Only love will win the day. Only someone willing to atone for the sins of others will turn the tidal wave of sin. There's no greater love than this, to lay down your life for others. We gaze upon the cross of Christ. We kiss the cross. We embrace the cross. And we find the grace of God's redeeming love. I do find it interesting that if Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden occurred on a Friday, it is fitting that John's story of Jesus' passion begins and ends in a garden. John writes, Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to where there was a garden. And John reports that Judas knew this place because Jesus had met there often with his disciples. The same motivation of selfishness and sin, of pride and perhaps greed that led to Adam and Eve's eviction from the Garden of Eden leads to Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane in John's Gospel, in the garden in John's Gospel. And after he's tried and tortured, convicted and executed, John notes that in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been buried. So like the first creation that began in the garden, the new creation will also come from a garden. But a garden is not the only place where the grace of God takes us on this Good Friday. God's grace also takes us to places where we'd rather not go, but places where we feel compelled to go and to pray. The place where we go today is reminiscent of a gathering several years ago of Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and Sufi Muslims on the grounds of Auschwitz and Birkenau. They met at these places of death, of evil, of unspeakable horror, to make a retreat and to pray. According to one of those on the retreat, every morning they walked an hour from Auschwitz, where they slept, to Birkenau, where they gathered in the railroad tracks at the center of the camp. This was the place where trains from all over Europe would unload and sort through the human cargo. Birkenau was the place where the sick were separated from the healthy, the homosexual from the heterosexual, the children from their parents. It was in November when these 150 people came from 10 countries and 4 world religions to sit down in the snow and to remember the dead. They formed a large ellipses about 75 yards long and sat in silent meditation twice a day, their breath curling up around their heads in the cold air. According to one of the participants, their purpose was to bear witness to what happened at that place, but also to listen for ways in which these events still echo in our lives today. What echoes do we hear as we gather around the cross and pray today, to remember the death of the ones, all those who've been brought near, all those who were separated or distant apart? Because that's what the cross does. The cross of Jesus seeks to draw all peoples near through his precious blood. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote from his prison cell where he would die for his resistance to the Nazis, quote, "To be a Christian does not mean to be religious in a particular way, but to be a person, the person that Christ creates in us. It is not the religious act that makes the Christian, but the participation in the suffering of Christ, in the sufferings of God. This is what makes us Christians, our willingness to participate in the sufferings of Jesus and the sufferings of the world. And that's what we're invited to do today, to enter more deeply into the sufferings of Christ. You know, in times like these, when the world is overwhelmed by this pandemic, when we're stalked each day by fear and grief, there are those who ask, where's God? Where's God in all this suffering and death? Good Friday, the day Christ died, responds to that question for me. Where is God? God's right here, in each of us, in the cross of his Son, Jesus. You know, when I was privileged to travel to Poland 3 years ago to give a series of conferences on precious blood spirituality to our missionaries there, I spent a day at Auschwitz, and it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. I've rarely been in a place where there were so many people and yet absolute stillness. No one dared to speak because of the echoes of Auschwitz are heard down through the decades. Elie Wiesel was a survivor and one of those who taught the world that we must never forget the suffering caused by the evil of the Holocaust. He was sent to Auschwitz when he was 15 years old. His memoir of surviving Auschwitz, called Night, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Well, reading it for the first time in college seared my soul with unforgettable images. And the most vivid image of that book for me was that 2 men and a young boy were hanged in front of the whole camp. Everyone in camp was forced to watch. Because of the weight of the 2 men, they died quickly. But because the boy was so light, the boy struggled between life and death for more than a half hour, while all the people in the camp were forced to watch this boy die. And as the boy, after a long time, was still in agony on that rope, Wiesel writes, I heard a man behind me cry, where is God? Where is God now? And I heard a voice within me answer, here is God. He is hanging from the gallows. One can interpret that image as the death of God on the gallows of human evil. But what today proclaims is the young Jewish man who dies on the gallows on a cross outside the holy city of Jerusalem, where they dump the garbage of the city. That this young man dies in solidarity with all those who die today, who will die of COVID-19, who will die by suicide or by gun violence in St. Louis or in Syria, in Kansas City or in Ho Chi Minh City, in New York or in New Orleans, in the emergency room, in an ICU, at the homeless shelter and in prison, at the nursing home and on the highway. Today is the day when God's heart is broken. As Jesuit Father William Barry writes, in Jesus, God saves us by becoming so vulnerable that we are able to kill him in a vile and humiliating way, and the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus assure us that God's offer of friendship will never be withdrawn, no matter what we do. If the cross did not result in the withdrawal of that offer, then nothing will lead to the change of God's heart. I want to conclude with a story about finding faith at the foot of the cross. There was a young man training to be an Olympic diver. Faith was a gift long deferred to this young man whose parents were practicing atheists. The only religious influence he really had was a college roommate who was a devout Christian. His friend was always trying to get the young diver to go to church with him, but the young diver politely refused. One night the diver went to the indoor pool at the college, and the lights were off, but the pool had a large skylights, and the moon was so bright and full that night that there was plenty of light for him to practice his dives. So he climbed to the highest diving board as he turned his back on the pool. And standing on the edge of the board, he extended his arms. And as he did, the light from the skylight cast his shadow upon the wall. The shadow of his body was in the shape of a cross. He stepped away from the edge of the diving board and knelt down. For the first time in his life, he prayed. he asked for the gift of faith. And as he was kneeling there on the diving board, a maintenance worker came in and turned on the lights. And when the diver looked down, he couldn't believe his eyes. The pool had been drained of water for repairs. The young diver had not seen the sign. No diving, pool closed for repairs. But standing on the edge of that diving board that night with arms outstretched, he saw the sign that saved his life. The young diver, seeing his shadow, the shadow of the cross on the wall, was a moment of grace, of recognition, of redemption. In that moment of truth, like the centurion who, seeing the way Jesus died on the cross, professed, "Surely this was the Son of God," so that diver found the gift of faith. I have never found my faith in God so strong as when I stood at the foot of the cross with my mom, my family, mourning the death of my brother, my sister, my father. Today, in the pain and anguish, the death and fear caused by COVID-19, may we find our place in the broken heart of God. And as we stand in solidarity across the miles at the foot of the cross, as we touch or kiss or knock on the wood of the cross today, may we know deep in our hearts that we too have found a home in God's heart, and we are never alone. May we continue to meet in prayer, especially today at the foot of the cross. Take good care. Stay safe.